I arrived a little late at the building tonight, and I usually have Deidre do this for me, but we didn't have time, and so I'm going to ask you, did I spill anything on my shirt? I have a bad habit that gets worse as I get older. And let me tell you about one time when I spilled something on my shirt. At the time, I was a realtor. I was teaching a real estate school and helped managing a real estate company in Missouri several years ago. And we had what we call a broker's open. We're very kind of a professional. You're around all those kind of people, and they always have these little snack foods on the little plate, and you walk around balancing that and a drink and eating that. And sure enough, I spilled something on my white shirt, right where it was obvious. And you may not know this about fat people, but we're self-conscious when it comes to food. When a skinny person spills something on them, somebody just goes, oh, he spilled something. But when a fat person spills something, they go, oh, yeah, food, of course. And so I went to the restroom. I had this blob of food just like right there that was just like screaming for attention. And so I went to the restroom and leaned over the sink and kind of did that little homemade wash job there and backed up and looked in the mirror. And what I had done is just spread it and highlighted it with a highlighter of water around it. And so it was much worse. And so then I was thinking, now what am I going to do? And I looked, and they had this little fancy basket full of disposable paper towels. And I thought I'll use one of those and blot it and help wipe that out. The little napkins were bright red. And in my panic, I wasn't doing the science, and wetting that red napkin and wiping it actually covered up the food stain pretty well and replaced it with a much bigger, much more obvious red stain that actually soaked through to the t-shirt and to the skin. And so here I am standing in this locked restroom looking like an idiot. And so what did I do? I stood there at the door of that restroom and remembered, this is part of my OCD, it kicked in. I could remember the floor plan of the house that we were in. And I remembered where the back door was. And so I waited until it got quiet in the hallway. And I just went down the hallway, through the back door, around to the front of the house, got in my car, and left. I just quit. Now, much to the chagrin of the two guys who rode with me, but I just went home. I was done for the day. You felt like that, haven't you? Where things just aren't going right, and it compounds one thing after another, and you realize, or at least you think, the best tact is to just quit and give up. And in some scenarios, like mine, that was probably the best thing to do. But have you ever felt like that spiritually? Be honest. It's just us. Have you ever gotten so discouraged that you felt like giving up? Maybe not giving up completely on your Christianity. Maybe you've been that low where you actually thought about walking away from the Lord, or it may be that you've done that at some point in your life. But maybe your level of quitting wasn't about just completely abandoning your Christianity, but backing away from it. Of not being the zealous, gung-ho Christian that you used to be. And I'm going to fill the pew, but that's about it. Have you ever felt that low? In our study of some interesting characters this week, we could probably point to several of these interesting characters that got that low spiritually. But I imagine one that you and I would agree on that got that low was the prophet Elijah. You know that story, don't you? In fact, would you turn with me in 1 Kings chapters 18 and 19? We talked last night about an obscure character, Uriah, and maybe in an event in his life that you're familiar with, but not from that vantage point. But tonight there's going to be no surprises. We're going to talk about a person from the Bible that you all know well and a story from his life that you all know well. And we want to talk about Elijah from the context of rising above discouragement. Because again, if we're honest with ourselves, we've all been there. And it might just be that you're there right now, that you're close to giving up, whatever giving up means to you. And I hope this lesson, I hope the text will inspire you to rise above that discouragement and to not give up. You remember the prophet Elijah. He stands in stark contrast of his godly nature and his godly message to the occupants of the throne in Israel, Ahab and Jezebel. Because of the wickedness of Ahab, Ahab was not content to just follow in his forefathers' footsteps. He took it a step further, built altars for Baal and a temple for a house where Baal could be worshiped. And Jezebel took it even further steps from that. She began to kill the prophets of God. Because of their wickedness, God, through the message of Elijah, brought a famine on the land. James would tell us for 3.5 years there was a famine. God now sends Elijah, you go speak to Ahab. And so Elijah goes and finds a man by the name of Obadiah. Obadiah is a servant in Ahab's household, high up servant. In fact, of the day that Elijah meets up with Obadiah, he is on a mission from the king to try to find a little bit of water, a little bit of grass to feed the livestock. Because King Ahab says, if we don't find something to feed them, we're going to have to kill the livestock. We're in a famine. And so Obadiah is out looking, and Elijah comes along and says, Obadiah, go tell King Ahab, I want to see him. And Obadiah says, do you hate me? I want to go tell Ahab that you want to see me, and the Spirit of the Lord's going to call you away, and Ahab's going to come because he's been looking for you forever. And he's going to come and you're not there, and instead of killing you, he's going to kill me. And Elijah says, no, I'll be there. So Ahab meets Elijah. And you remember the famous interchange between them when he says, when Ahab sees Elijah, says, oh, you troubler of Israel. And Elijah says, not so fast, buddy. I'm not the troubler. You are the troubler of Israel. And he says, condensing the story a little bit here, he says, let's meet on Mount Carmel. You bring the prophets of Baal, and I'll represent Jehovah. And you remember that story, don't you, in 1 Kings chapter 18. They get there, and Elijah says, you go first. There's more of you. There were 450 prophets of Baal. In total, 850 prophets of both these false gods. And so he says, you go first. And we're going to have a contest. We'll put the oxen on the altar, we'll supply the wood, but we won't supply the fire. We'll let our gods, our respective gods, supply the fire, because anybody can offer something to a god, but the real proof is if that God can offer something in return. And again, you know the story. Starts in the morning. They began crying out to Baal. It gets about lunchtime. And here's where I can relate to Elijah. Elijah turns into a little bit of a smart aleck and says, maybe y'all aren't loud enough. Maybe Baal's taking a nap and he can't hear you. Or maybe he's on a trip and you need to yell real loud to get him in this remote location. Or maybe he's meditating and that enrages them and they began to shout and to jump and even, as with their custom, cutting themselves. And they're bleeding all over. And still, and I love what the text says, no one answered, no one replied, no one sent fire. And so Elijah's sitting patiently all day. It's the time for evening sacrifice, and Elijah says, sit down. He prepares the altar, has to repair the altar of God, takes 12 stones for the 12 tribes of Israel, builds this altar. They put the oxen on it, they put the wood under it, and probably pauses for dramatic effect and says, wait a minute, we're missing something. Bring some water. And they bring 12 pitchers of water, and he digs this little ditch around it, and they douse. And they must have thought this man a fool, because we're in the midst of a famine and he's pouring water. He's wasting water, pouring it on this altar and expecting his God to set this water-drenched sacrifice ablaze. The text doesn't tell us this, but I like to think that when Elijah pauses and addresses his God, that he may have taken a different tack. He's probably not shouting and screaming and jumping up and down. I like to think of him as saying, just to twist that knife a little further into the prophets of Baal, maybe very calmly and very quietly speaking to God. And he says, God, show these people who God is, and that I'm your prophet, and maybe this event will turn their hearts back to you. And God answers in dramatic fashion. Fire rains down from heaven and doesn't just consume, destroys the sacrifice and the altar. And the people, in what we can only guess is maybe a temporary response to what has happened, says, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. And Elijah seizes upon that temporary zeal and says, grab the prophets of Baal, and he brings them down and he slaughters them. God tells Elijah now we're going to make it rain. And Elijah sends message to Ahab again, and says, you better get home because I hear the sound of rain approaching. And Elijah and his servant go out and back to Mount Carmel, and he's sitting there, and he sends his messenger out for the weather report 7 times. Do you see anything? Do you see anything? No, nothing. The skies are clear. The 7th time, the servant says, I see a little cloud about the size of a man's fist. And so he again sends message to Ahab, Ahab, you better get home before it starts raining. And so Ahab gets in his chariot and goes, and by that time the clouds have multiplied and turned dark, and it begins to rain. And the Lord sends His Spirit upon Elijah, and Elijah ran. I don't know how he did it, but the text says that he outran the chariot of Ahab and got to Jezreel first. And Ahab, we're not surprised, goes back probably pouting to Jezebel, tells him the story of the defeat for him and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, how he slaughtered the prophets. And Jezebel sends message to Elijah and says, you've got 24 hours to live. I'm going to kill you like you killed those prophets. And you know the story as it continues. Elijah flees. And he finds himself all the way back to Mount Horeb, where Moses received the law of God. He's gone from Israel to Judah to Beersheba, and now has gone all the way back to Mount Sinai. And it's there that he just sits down under a tree and prays. What for the first time as we read it is a surprising prayer, because he says, God, I'm ready to die. God, I give up. Just take me now. And as so many years ago, when Moses asked on that same mountain to see the presence of God, and God hid him in the cleft of the rock and passed by behind him, God makes another appearance at Mount Sinai, but this time to the prophet Elijah. There's a strong wind that blows, and then an earthquake, and then fire comes down. And then a small, still voice speaks to Elijah and asks him twice this question: why are you here? Where are you, Elijah? And Elijah, again, this time in a more direct prayer, asked God to just take me. I give up. I'm the only one. We're outnumbered. I am the only prophet left who will stand on your side. And God will answer that prayer. Not the way that Elijah wants it answered, but in a far, far better way. And I want us to talk about Elijah in that moment. A moment of spiritual despair and despondency that we can probably all relate to on one level or another. The first thing I want us to consider about this spiritual discouragement that Elijah and you and I have found ourselves in is that it can happen fast or slow. What we don't know about Elijah's situation is, has this been building for years? It's possible. He's done his role, his mission of prophesying during the reign of Ahab, who was even worse than his father Omri. He's never had a good king. He's never lived in good spiritual conditions. This conflict between Ahab and Jezebel and Elijah has been happening for years now. And so could it be that Elijah's just been worn down by time? Or is it this discouragement as sudden as it might appear as we read this story? Because what's one thing striking about this story is that Elijah's just had a literal mountaintop experience. He should be flying as high as a kite. He has finally demonstrated in the face of Ahab, all the prophets, the worshipers of Baal, of all of Israel, that Jehovah is God. The greatest victory that he's ever experienced in his life. And now he's down in the valley, ready to die. But you know, discouragement can work that way, can't it? It can work slow. Time, circumstances, or people can wear us down over years till we just want to give up. Or it can happen almost suddenly. And even after some great victory, I think the text seems to indicate that Elijah thought that that contest on Mount Carmel would turn the tide of faith. Let's look at a couple passages there that I think that might indicate that. Chapter 18, verse 37, when he's praying to God to send the fire down when it's his turn, he says in 18, verse 37, "Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you again." And before the contest, he says, echoing the words of the leader Joshua years before, "Choose you this day. If Baal's God, choose him. If God's God, choose him." And so he seems to maybe think that this event is going to turn the people back to God. But it doesn't. Have you ever faced that? Maybe at the local church, you got behind some project, some work, some Bible class, some thing that was going on, and man, you were excited about it. This is going to be great. Everybody's going to love this VBS, or everybody's going to love this Bible class we're having this quarter, or everybody's going to love this thing that we're doing, and you get behind it, and you spend time and sacrifice and money and everything to get behind it, and it just flops. 3 people show up. And you just want to give up. Elijah felt alone. Yes, God will remind him that he's not really alone. There's 7,000, he'll tell him, there at Horeb, that haven't bowed the knee to Baal or kissed his image. But Elijah was still alone. He didn't imagine the source of his discouragement. And it's true that if he was alone as a prophet, it wasn't just because people didn't care. Part of it was because Jezebel had killed so many of them. It wasn't their fault. They didn't show up. But he still felt alone. He felt isolated. And that so often, as you know, leads to discouragement. And so the second point we want to learn from the story of discouragement in Elijah is really from the other side, from the people. Those that should have supported Elijah. It was 450 to 1 at Mount Carmel. I've wondered, and there's no way of knowing this for sure, but what if just one had stood with him? What if just some married couple had shown up and said, Elijah, we're with you. What can we do? Elijah wasn't imagining it. Yes, they were 7,000 who haven't bowed, but he still felt alone. He still didn't feel supported in his work and his ministry. And I'm going to tell you, that'll kill a servant of God's zeal quicker than anything. Keith Miller, in his book entitled Passionate People, and I don't know that Keith is the first to come up with this analogy, but he talks about two types of people in our life: balcony people or basement people. And I want to ask you, which one are you? Mr. Miller, in his book, Passionate People, describes basement people as those people that are always trying to pull you down. Their favorite sayings are, it won't work. Or, we tried that before. Or, why bother? They're the type of people who have a problem for every solution. They just want to just rain on everybody's parade. It seems like they're miserable, and their favorite saying, again, is misery loves company. So join me in the basement, and let's just do nothing. But then he also describes balcony people. Those are the people sitting up in the loft in the balcony. Those are the people always applauding and cheering you on. They're cheering on the young girl on stage who's trembling and shaking and forgot the words to the song, but they're applauding anyway. To the young boy playing the trumpet who can't find the note to save his life, but they give him a standing ovation anyway. They're the type of people that are always encouraging and pulling people up and saying, that's a great idea. Let's try that. I'm glad you thought of that. What can I do to help? And so I want to ask you, be honest. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. But if you're honest with yourself, are you a basement person or a balcony person? Would you have been there to support, to cheer on Elijah, to encourage him? To stop him on the road to Horeb and say, Elijah, I'm sorry. These people are lousy. But don't give up. One side of this is found in the book of Hebrews chapter 12. Will you turn there? If you're the type that maybe right now you're being discouraged and you're feeling alone, I want to caution you to look for the signs. See the signs of discouragement in your life and make the necessary corrections before you get so down and out that you're ready to give up. Hebrews chapter 12, look at these two verses 14 and 15. In talking about our interpersonal relationships, he says, pursue, Hebrews 12:14, pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. I think what the Hebrew writer is cautioning us in this letter of encouraging these brethren and us not to fall away, that one sure sign that apostasy is coming in your life is a root of bitterness. You've seen it. You've seen it in others. It's easier to see in others, isn't it? And maybe you've seen it in yourself. A sure sign that somebody is losing their faith and ready to give up is that they just become bitter. They're bitter about everything, everybody, and they can't find a positive thing to say about anything. Look for those signs in yourself. But secondly, do whatever you can to be the reason, or at least one of the reasons, that somebody else doesn't give up. And I'm going to get personal here. And I can do this safely because I'm not your preacher or your elder. But support your spiritual leaders. They need that. Look with me in the book of 2 Corinthians. Paul writes the sequel to his first letter in 2 Corinthians, and I'm turning over to chapter 12. And he's not dealing with the moral problems that he dealt with in the first letter, but he's dealing with largely the fact that they did not come to his defense. People had heard that harsh message of 1 Corinthians, and some people had said, well, that's just Paul. Paul's not really an apostle. Do you know that? And they began to run down Paul, and that part almost seemed expected by Paul. And it bothered him, but it didn't bother him as much as the rest of them didn't come to his defense. And so he says things like this. Look in 2 Corinthians. I'm in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Let's pick up the reading in verse 11. I've become a fool in boasting. Now, the term boasting here, he's using almost tongue-in-cheek to talk about him defending himself. I've had to defend myself. I've become an appearance as a fool in boasting, but you've compelled me. For I ought to have been commended by you. For in nothing was I behind the most eminent apostles, though I am nothing. Truly the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance and signs and wonders and mighty deeds. For what is it in you which you were inferior to other churches, except that I myself was not burdensome to you? Forgive me this wrong. Now for the third time I'm ready to come to you, and I will not be burdensome to you, for I do not seek yours, but you. For the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. And I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls, though I more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved. But be that as it may, I did not burden you. Nevertheless, being crafty, I caught you by cunning. You can hear the hurt in that, can't you? You forced me to look like a fool. Because it looks like boasting when I'm just having to defend myself because you wouldn't do it. And you should have done it. You should have come to my defense. In chapter 13, maybe one of the most famous verses in all of 2 Corinthians is in chapter 13, verse 5, and I think it's one that we've largely misunderstood. He says in verse 13, examine yourselves whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you become disqualified? How many sermons have we talked about self-examination as a Christian, and we started with that verse, but I don't think Paul is saying at all that you examine yourselves to see whether you're a Christian or not. That's not his point. Look at the context. What he's saying here is, are you a Christian to the church at Corinth? And they would say, of course we are. And Paul was saying, how did you get to be a Christian? It was me. Examine yourselves. Are you in the faith? Yes, you are. How did you learn the faith? Who preached the gospel to you? It was me. So he wasn't challenging them to really examine their faith. He was challenging them to examine their relationship to the one who had brought them to the faith. Shame on you for not defending me, Paul says. If someone is giving their life to shepherd you, spending their life to teach you the Word of God, be their champion. Support them and encourage them. Just one small word of kindness. And can I get real preachy? Find something positive to say. Oh, I know we made a mistake in our PowerPoint. I know the verb doesn't always agree with the noun. And I know we said Noah when we meant Moses. And yeah, I know John 3:16 would have been a better verse to use in point number 2 of that sermon. But how about just saying, thank you? I want to tell you about my grandpa. I wished y'all could have known my grandpa. I get my size from my grandpa. He was a wonderful and big, strong man. His name was Ithema Swilling Duke. Most people called him Mr. Duke. That was either because they couldn't pronounce Ithema or it's because they were afraid of him because he was a big man. I never heard my grandpa preach a sermon, give a talk, lead a song. Rarely would he even lead prayer at church. But when I was a kid, a teenager, there was a group of people in the congregation who were trying to get rid of the preacher. They didn't like him. Not because he was teaching anything false, they just didn't like him. And so they were trying their best to get rid of him. He expressed some interest to go preach in a neighboring town that didn't have a church, and so he would need outside support. Those people that didn't like him became the greatest champion of supporting him financially as long as he went somewhere else. This was a small congregation, rural, we did business meetings. My grandpa spoke in favor of supporting the preacher to go do this work. It was announced by that preacher that he was leaving. Everybody knew the situation. My grandpa, who had never spoke before the congregation before, raised his hand and got up and says, I want to say a few words. And he walked slowly to the front of that congregation and said, I fully am behind supporting this brother in his work because he's done such a good job for us and he'll do a good job for them. I am not behind supporting him to get rid of him. And shame on you who are. I wanted to stand up and just, yeah, Grandpa, you tell him. And he said it in his John Wayne kind of fashion, that he didn't use these words, but they were implied. And if you want to talk about it, we'll meet behind the building after services. I loved my grandpa before then, but he became a hero that day. Be a balcony person. Lastly, and very quickly, because we're already out of time, you, like Elijah, can go from darkness to light. You can relate to Elijah, can't you? You can relate to being in that darkness. And Elijah is there, and God comes to him, and he asks him, Elijah, what are you doing here? What are you doing here, Elijah? And what a question for somebody in discouragement, because discouragement can take us places, can it? If we're not careful, discouragement can take us places physically that we shouldn't be. And discouragement can take us spiritually places that we shouldn't be. And so when you get discouraged and you're wondering, I want you to hear the voice of God saying, what are you doing here? And proving that Elijah wanted to prove that he was a man, and so he goes to his cave. And he hides out in that cave. You know, we all have coping mechanisms, don't we? Most of them bad. To cope with our darkness and our discouragement. And your coping mechanism may be to lash out at people. Your coping mechanism may be to just do what I did, sneak out the back door and don't come back. Elijah's was to hide in the cave. God drew him out of that cave and gave him some charges. He says, you go anoint Hazael, king of Syria, and you anoint Jehu, king of Israel, and you anoint Elisha to be your successor. And we're going to clean house. If Hazael doesn't kill him, Jehu will. If Jehu doesn't kill him, Elisha will. We're going to take care of this problem, Elijah. And God tries to bring Elijah out of that darkness into that light. A couple tips real quickly I think we can learn from this. How to get from darkness to light. First of all, and I appreciate Jackson leading those songs that encouraged us to do just that. See God. God made an appearance to Elijah in his darkest moment. He might have been on a mountain, but he was in a spiritual valley, and God showed up. In the earthquake, the strong wind, and the fire, but God spoke in that quiet whisper, and maybe that's what God's doing today. Maybe God's speaking in a whisper. Can you hear the whisper of God? Balcony people, can you be the whisper of God in somebody's life? See the good around you. God tried to show to Elijah, it's bad, but it's not all bad. We won't turn over there for sake of time. Philippians chapter 4, he says, whatsoever things are just, noble, you remember a good report, think on these things. He's not just saying study your Bible, there's what the good things are. He would say that, but he's also saying in life, there are good things in life. There's noble things. Find those things. Meditate, see those things. Don't focus on the negative, Elijah. Take time to rest and renew. Elijah needed a nap and a meal. Sometimes you need that. Find your ways to rejuvenate and to recharge your spiritual battery. Don't go away, but take a little time away. Rest with the intent that you're going to come back, recharged and renewed, and realize you're not alone. There are more than 7,000 knees in this country that haven't bowed the knee to the God Baal, the God abortion, the God evolution, whatever you want to insert in there. You're not alone. And the answer to Elijah's discouragement was, Elijah, now that you've had a nap and a cry, and a meal, let's get up and get to work. You've got some more work to do before your time is done. Immerse yourself in the work. Help others. Find someone who's spiritually weaker than you and seek to encourage, to be the balcony person for them. And what you're going to find out is as you're pulling them up from your balcony, that they're actually going to push you up further into that balcony. And you'll be encouraged by the work that you're doing together. I appreciate you being patient with me tonight as we've talked about what we all go through is the idea of the low spiritual moments in our lives. And I want to encourage you, whatever you have to do, don't give up. You're not alone. See God in your life. See the good in life. Look to find someone else who can be your balcony person, and you be somebody else's balcony person, and you be there applauding and cheering them on, saying, we can do this. Would you become a Christian tonight? You have a group of people here who will stand and cheer for you as you make the best decision in your life, who will be there to encourage you. They will all, I promise you this, they'll all be your balcony people and help you make it to your goal. Would you do that right now as together we stand and as we sing?
I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained within, seeking to rise no more. But the Master of the sea heard my despairing cry. From the waters lifted me, now safe am I. Love lifted me and me, love lifted me and me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me, love lifted me and me, love lifted me and me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me. All my heart to Him I give, and to Him I cling. In His blessed presence live, ever His praises sing. Love so mighty and so true, merits my soul's best songs. Faithful, loving service due to Him belongs. Love lifted me and me, love lifted me and me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me, love lifted me and me, love lifted me and me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me. Souls in danger, look above. Jesus completely saves. He will lift you by His love out of the angry waves. He's the Master of the sea, builds His will obey. He, your Savior, wants to be saved today. Love lifted me and me, love lifted me and me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me, love lifted me and me, love lifted me and me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me.
All right. Well, to Ken, we say thank you and amen. We really appreciate that lesson and appreciate his ability to stir our hearts, even with stories that we may know fairly well, but to help us see them from a different point of view in a way that is truly inspiring. And I have to share this. I couldn't help but think of all the balcony people in my life and how many balcony people I have in this room right now. And I could just go on and share so many names of so many people here that I've known throughout the years who've inspired me. But I want to mention one, and I bet he doesn't remember this. When I was baptized into Christ, it happened to be on a Sunday in Lubbock, Texas, in which my dad was preaching because our regular preacher was out of town in a meeting. And when the regular preacher came back the next Sunday, he went out to eat with our family, which was kind of a custom. We always went to the Western Sizzler to eat. Yeah, the old Sizzler. And Brother Brent Lewis was in line right beside me as we went through the line. And I remember Brent putting his arm on my shoulder and saying, quote, "I heard some good news about you. I am very proud of you. You probably don't remember that, Brother Lewis, but I remember it as vividly as if it happened just 10 minutes ago. There's power in being balcony people, folks. Never underestimate that. And all of you who are balcony people to so many, God bless you. God bless you, because there's always those Elijahs out there that we need to help pick up and help encourage in their walk. Nobody is perfect. Everybody needs help. So thank you, Ken. Thank you very, very much. We have one more night of our gospel meeting, and that'll be tomorrow night with our assembly here. I know many of you are visiting, and so thankful for you to come and be with us. Just to let you know, and anybody else who may be wondering, all these lessons are on our live stream, and they'll certainly be on the website for you to watch and enjoy again. Are there any other announcements that need to be made from the elders here? I did hear that Shane got a good report. So very thankful for that. Shane got a good report. And he missed another sermon by Ken. I'm just stating the obvious. But I'm so glad he's doing well. All right, we're going to be led in a closing prayer by Brother Keith, and then you'll be dismissed. Keith.